and today we are going to talk about cellular respiration, the process through which your cells, plant cells, fungal cells derive their energy, their ATP, from the foods that they ingest. So we're talking about the opposite of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is taking sunlight and making sugars from that, and cellular respiration is then using those sugars to drive any kind of cellular process, anything that needs energy. Today we're going to be short on the video notes, but eventually we're going to be talking about the different parts of cellular respiration, including glycolysis, which is how it starts, and the actual process of aerobic cellular respiration and anaerobic cellular respiration, known as fermentation, and some pathways used by cells during exercise. So the first thing I like to talk about is, what do we mean when we talk about energy? Well, in science, there is a unit called a calorie, and you'll notice that it has a capital C. And there's also a unit called a calorie, with a lowercase c. And it turns out that one capital C calorie is equal to 1,000 lowercase c calories. In other parts of the world, they call the capital C calorie 1 kilocalorie. And this is the type of calorie that you look up if you look on your food labels and you see how many calories those are worth. So you might look at a little snack and it might have 200 calories in it. That's the same thing as 200 kilocalories. So notice that capital letter when you're taking a look at your food packages. It turns out that one lower C calorie is a nice little unit. It's not super well used, but it happens to be a nice unit for us because it's the energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. And in general, humans on average need to eat about 2,000 calories per day, and about 3/4 of that or so goes into just maintaining normal homeostasis throughout the body. We're talking about things like your body temperature and your heart rate and being able to breathe. And so, 75% of it goes right into that. And you might ask, well, how do they measure that? If the calorie is equal to a unit of energy used to raise water 1 degree Celsius, how in the world do you go about equating that to the food that we eat? We're not really raising water. And the answer is it's not an exact science, but the best I can show you here is this little sketch. Essentially what you do is you take a sample of water that you know the mass of in a test tube, and you take some type of food and you burn it. And then usually there's some kind of known mass of food. You light that food on fire and it burns and it warms the water up. And through some math, you can calculate how many calories. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that on the industrial scale. Obviously, not all the heat goes into the water, but this is the method we are going to be using when we're testing the different types of food calories in the lab. You guys are going to be burning some food, and there's a lot of weaknesses to this method, but it's the general principle that we're after here. When we talk about calories, I always like to bring up Michael Phelps. Michael Phelps was a world-renowned Olympic swimmer. He's probably still the winningest Olympian of all time in terms of how many medals he would win. During his training, instead of 2,000 calories a day, Michael Phelps would consume about 12,000 calories per day. And what you're looking at is a picture of the amount of food that he ate on a given day. So for breakfast, he would start off with 3 fried egg sandwiches. He would have grits, which is a cereal, 5-egg omelet, pancakes, French toast. We're talking about a lot of carbohydrates. You and I couldn't ingest that many carbohydrates. We'd gain a lot of weight real quick. But Michael Phelps was an Olympian swimmer, and the dude is swimming and training and running and weightlifting, 8-10 hours a day, probably 6 days a week. For lunch, he'd have about a pound of pasta, some ham and cheese sandwiches, and he would use energy drinks, about 1,000 calories of energy drinks, which are shown there in the picture. And then for dinner, more pasta, a whole pizza, and even more of those energy drinks. So it's not necessarily that he was eating large masses of food, but the foods that he was eating were calorie dense. And so all total, it's about 12,000 calories. And I doubt seriously if anyone in this room could actually ingest 12,000 calories in a given day unless they were going through a lot of physical activity, such as playing a particular sport or something of that nature. All right, so cellular respiration. The process of turning carbohydrates into usable energy at your cellular level is called cellular respiration. And by usable energy, we are talking about the manufacture of ATP that we talked about in the photosynthesis chapter, that adenosine triphosphate. The overall net equation of cellular respiration is C6H12O6. That's your glucose. Combined with oxygen that you're currently breathing in, is going to yield an output of carbon dioxide and water. This net equation is exactly backwards of photosynthesis. If you remember, photosynthesis was you take your water, you take carbon dioxide, you have sunlight shining onto the chloroplasts of the plants, and they're going to take the water and strip the electrons off, making oxygen. They're going to take the carbon dioxide, and they're building carbohydrates with that. This is exactly the reverse of that. We're taking those carbohydrates, they are going into your mitochondria. Your mitochondria are taking oxygen, and in chemistry, this is actually called a combustion reaction. You're burning the sugar. Now, we're not doing that with like visible flames inside. There's a lot of other chemistry reactions that are going on, just like there was in photosynthesis. But the net overall reaction is like we are taking that sugar and we are burning it. And we're producing ATP in the end. You'll notice there's no ATP in this part, but the end product of it is you're making ATP in the cells. I'm going to end today by just talking about the basic, what I call schematic here, of what cellular respiration is all about. We're going to start at the top of the box here, and we are going to have sugars into this. And so the sugars are going to go into a section here, and this section right here is called glycolysis. Glycolysis is a quick way to generate energy. It doesn't generate much energy, but it generates enough. So let's say that you have a quick task that involves maybe heavy lifting, so you have to move several boxes of books. Your muscle cells might just go through glycolysis in order to do that, because you don't have to make much of the ATP to do that. You got to make a little bit. But if you're going to be running a marathon or doing something where you need a lot of energy over a longer period of time, glycolysis isn't going to cut it. But when you start the glycolysis process, you're making 2 ATP molecules every cycle of these chemical reactions. And you know that, yeah, but that's not a whole lot of ATP. That's an adequate amount for a short period of time, but it's not enough to power us. If there's not very much oxygen present, and so there's little oxygen available to you, you go through a process called fermentation that we'll take a bigger look at here in a little bit. This is also called anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic means without oxygen. And so without the oxygen, you do things like ferment. This is the type of thing that happens in baker's yeast and even in the making of drinkable alcohols. You ferment those alcohols. What fermentation will do is they will produce for you enough materials to go through glycolysis again if there's not enough oxygen present. One of the problems with that is one of the byproducts of that is lactic acid. If you've ever done a whole bunch of, say, crunches or push-ups or sit-ups, and you haven't been doing it very often, and you just suddenly decide one day, I'm going to do 30 sit-ups, 50 push-ups. The next day, you're probably going to be sore. The reason why you are sore is because of the buildup of that lactic acid in your muscles. Is because you did not have enough oxygen present in your cells to go through the process called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration happens if you have plenty of oxygen present. Ladies and gentlemen, if you play a sport, at the beginning of every sports season, you probably go through conditioning, lots of running. What is that important for? That is important for getting your cells used to getting enough oxygen to them to give cellular respiration so that you actually produce a lot more energy for you. The end product of aerobic respiration, where you have enough oxygen present through cellular respiration, is producing 36 adenosine triphosphate molecules per series of chemical reactions. And remember, your cells are doing thousands of these reactions, producing tens of thousands of these ATP molecules. And the best example I can give for you is your muscles. Your muscles need these ATP in order to work long periods of time. So, like I said, if you want to do something short, glycolysis and fermentation is fine as long as you're okay with that buildup of that lactic acid that's going to do that. Another product of that could be ethyl alcohol, which you get in like baker's yeast or something like that, which is usually boiled right off, depending on what types of cells are doing the fermentation. But in human cells, we build up that lactic acid. But again, you're only producing 2 ATP, so that's a short period of time to do a lot of work. Long period of time, you need that cellular respiration. You need to be well oxygenated. So that's why you're doing all of those activities to build endurance up if you're into a sport. So something like volleyball, where there's not a lot of running in it, you're still active all of the time, and so building up your resistance. Also, the more running you do, the more exercise you do, the more aerobic exercise you do, the more mitochondria your cells will build in those muscles that are being used. The more mitochondria, the better you can produce ATP. Next time we get together, we're going to talk about details of this. But for right now, thank you very much.